No, it's my turn.
Yeah, okay, sure.
We had agreed previously that I would comment, and then we'll open it up for questions. And first of all, the intervening period of 20 years, the 20 years between when I wrote and when Nick wrote, a lot came out, a lot of discussion going on. So his presentation, both in 2010 and now, reflect this additional insight. And certainly something that I was not focused on at the time, the use of the ashlar blocks increases the importance of the performance area, which I think that we are looking at. In fact, we're looking at the place for performance is a theatral area for performances, and certainly a backdrop with Enkomi's ashlar blocks, either stolen or imitated, would reinforce it. I certainly like the idea of the two-sword story being as part of possibly of how they brought this all together. And one of the things we have to be careful of, my old colleague at Brock, Noel Robertson, used to rage about the false documents of the 4th century. Things that were made up in Athenian, during the 4th century by Athenians to justify what's happening in the 4th with reference to the 5th, which didn't happen, but the inscriptional evidence was presented, so that I think that most of these Homeric references to Cyprus are documents of a later period for various reasons. So I think that would make it a much more complete picture for the early 8th, mid 8th, and late 8th century. Now, to me, one of the real issues here is that certainly Vassos Karagiorgis, when he presented the material, he had a purpose behind this, which was connecting Salamis and Cyprus to Greece, and that he emphasized, as Nick has pointed out, this list of Homeric possibilities, while downplaying other things. And that in essence he also isolated the tombs. And I think that what Nick has done here, and I think he should continue to do, is to contextualize these in the greater picture of Cypro-Geometric, Cypro-Archaic burial practices, tomb architecture. Because they are unique, but they were not created by aliens. In other words, this just didn't happen. There is a background to all of this, and I think that they are building on traditions. Now, one thing, because I really haven't studied Enkomi, is whether those two built tombs in the houses below the floor, whether there's any evidence that those could have been visible in the geometric period. In other words, in Enkomi, it's very unusual is that the tombs are under the floors of the houses and then covered up, so that if you have the settlement abandoned and then everything goes on top, you would have to do a lot of digging. So if the excavation revealed that, in fact, somebody had been mucking about looking for it, and the material found inside the tombs had later material, then you might say that there's some emulation of the idea of, even though they're small, relatively small, that this is the idea which they expanded because they needed an area for performance. One doesn't think that there was probably performance at the Enkomi tombs. So it's you would have to look at the excavation reports very carefully to see whether there's any indication. Now, the presence of possibly two sanctuaries at Enkomi fits in with other patterns. On Crete, most of the palaces had in the ruins evidence of this, so they were aware of the ruins. They made use of it. So I see that as, again, a good sign for linking people of New Salamis, linking themselves to Old Salamis. in a very useful fashion. One of the problems that this debate, which I started about how the Cypriot, what then were called kingdoms, and then city kingdoms, and now Maria Iakovou, a couple of 2 years ago, while vacillating, thinks maybe we should be talking about polities because we have really no idea of the political structure of these. There were kings, but that doesn't necessarily mean, or basileus, that these were. So these polities, the argument that I put up was that these pop up, they're very spectacular, and then they settle down, and then they just disappear. We don't really see such amazing burial traditions in the latter part of the Iron Age. And so I thought this as a reflection of the first kings doing something to impress their local audience and their descendants, survivors, to also connect themselves to this. Now, in talking, I think, if I'm not incorrect, I think you mentioned a new lineage. And I think some other, maybe Sarah Janes and some other people have used, it's a new lineage. Well, the question is, we both agree that something has happened, but is there continuity? Because a new lineage would say, well, in the 11th century, you already had kingship, whatever you want to call it, and this is a new group of people who say we're started a new dynasty and goes on from there, which is not much different, really, from what I'm saying, except there's no evidence for the 10th, 9th century for any evidence of this. And this is one of the problems that this all brings out is, in Cyprus, we have a lot of evidence in the 12th century. We started losing it in the 11th century. In the 10th and the 9th, there's almost nothing, which is partly probably a result of lack of interest and lack of something that you can get your hands on. Even though people have been looking for over 100 years, one would see this. And then in the earlier 8th century, things start to happen on a spectacular scale. And then in the 7th century, 6th century, we settle down. One of the problems is that if you want to talk about the continuity, you have this problem of this gap. Gap not meaning there's nothing there, but it's very little. And then most of the evidence that we have for Cypriot Iron Age really is in the 7th, 6th century. Cypro-Archaic 1, as it is called, Cypro-Archaic 2, and that many people, and again I saw that in rereading Maria Iakovou's article, seem to take what we see in the 7th, 6th, and want to push it back into the 8th and before, where it could have been, that could be, but there's no evidence for this. Rich evidence in the 7th, in fact, reflects something earlier. So we're left with this problem of the meaning of this, and one of the things that many people, including Maria Iakovou, reacted against was that my suggestion is that this is secondary state formation stimulated by the Phoenicians, through Kition as well as their other city kingdoms, and that when you look at the burial assemblage and you don't try to assign greatness to it, you just say, what is it? You'll see that most of this is Near Eastern. And if you look at what little we know about Assyrian royal burial customs, you'll see that a lot of this is found in contemporary evidence that we have, mostly literary, but some textual evidence and some burials. So that these thrones, these are Near Eastern. These are Near Eastern. The stools are Near Eastern. The iron, the silver-clad coated furniture. The designs again are not Egyptian; they're Phoenicio-Egyptian. They have reworked them for an export market, much the way the Chinese reworked in the 18th, 17th, 18th century. Reworked their art for a foreign market, and then later in England it was reworked as well. So that many of these features are in fact I would say Near Eastern, Levantine, and a little further to the east. And to me, it's more probable, and I like your idea about that Salaminian practices influence rather than were influenced, is that it's quite possible that this is in fact, the debate is when was what era does the Iliad reflect, or at least in this case the burial practice, the burial rites for Patroclus, is that this could be a later insertion. What is fitting? We have this. Plus, we also, of course, have the stuff from Lefrandia, etc. So that I would think that we best leave the Homeric alone in dealing with this, and concentrate on the where this might come from. Now, what does this leave us? It leaves us with a problem. The problem is, after this was dug in the 60s, work has been done, we still really have not come to any great conclusions about the path of Cypriot sociopolitical development from the 11th century onward. Now, one thing that Maria Iacovu is pushing lately is about fluctuations. You have periods of this and then dull periods, etc., which is possibly a good way of looking at it if we're talking about polities. But that not all of this, I mean, we could be looking at in the 11th, 10th, 9th century as chieftains, something like that, and then a more centralized form of government is created, which doesn't necessarily. One of the things I don't see a great deal of evidence for, you made a point about competition between regions. I'm not sure in the 8th century there was a great deal of competition between regions. Maybe with Kition, I think with Kition, and maybe with Tamassos and the inland kingdoms, but I'm not sure that you going to Almaphus, whether Kurion in fact was a kingdom, so-called kingdom center, or Paleipaphos, whether there was any natural rivalry at that time, because all the evidence we have for boundary identification in some fashion in the form of rural sanctuaries is really a 7th century phenomenon. In other words, it starts showing up at the end of, well, not even in Cypro-Geometric 3, it's really Cypro-Archaic from the 8th century, 7th century. So that I think this is something where we are left with competing ideas. I wrote probably 15 years ago the present situation and future of Iron Age Cypriot archaeology, and it doesn't to me have changed much in the sense that we really don't, there's not been enough problem-oriented research to say, okay, Rupp right, theory petite, not right, Iacovu right, what have you, because, and then we have some new data sets. So this is, I think you've done a masterful job of building on what you had already done. In fact, I think what you presented here, Sarah Janes, who is, there's a couple of other people who have recently been working on Iron Age Cyprus, is that I think possibly your approach is going to be more useful than playing around with GIS this and GIS that. In other words, looking at things that are more substantial. Quite possibly, and this is something I tried many years ago, is to look at all of these burial assemblages and try to run levels of inequality versus this and see whether there's a pattern. I think that more could be done there with the kind of computing that is available, the kind of what we have, which wasn't available 20, 30 years ago. So anyway, you've been treated to a masterly review. It's complex. None of you should to read the excavations at Salamis, the 2 volumes, which I have poured through for my research. You don't want to do that unless you're really tired and need, or you can't go to sleep. It's not one of those grippers. What Nick has done is taken the essence out of that, put it into a context which where it's clear where we agree and clear where we wish to discuss it further, and that it's something that it's worth visiting as an outsider, because such burial assemblages are, and not just one, we're not talking one, we're talking, as you've seen from the royal, so-called royal tomb cemetery, many of them, and though there are many, they're not all the same. This is one of the problems, that there's no pattern. There is a pattern, in a broad pattern, but there's no specific pattern. So all of this is compiled. To get a Homeric burial, right, you have to take something from here, something from there, and the same thing with this. The problem, of course, was the tomb chambers. Nick mentioned this, but it should be re-emphasized. They were looted long ago, so we have no idea what was in the tomb chamber itself. This is only in the dromos, and the looters never bothered to, they didn't think that there'd be anything there. So they just went for the tomb chamber and left all of this. So all of this material is spectacularly preserved in the tomb chamber and meticulously excavated by Vassos Karagiorgis and his team. So this is where we stand. It's tempting to go back, but I'm not sure I will. Anyway, we wish to thank you for an excellent lecture, and questions. You actually asked me. Don't ask me. I'm stepping aside. Do you have any questions for Nick? Comments? Complaints? You'll get extra rations if you agree with certain scholars at the end. Who's going to ask the first question? That's the first time. We shut them up, I don't believe. There must be something that's outside. This is a little, not quite incestuous, but isn't it nice to have something other than Cretan Bronze Age to people just talk about the incestuous? We have Iron Age. Oh, okay, double axe. What do you think of? You've used GIS at Athens in the sanctuary. What do you think of Sarah Jane's use of the GIS in trying to search for patterns in the burial assemblies? Now she's doing, she did Cypro-Geometric through Cypro-Archaic.
I mean, I would say it's certainly a useful exercise, but I think that there's a flaw in the data, and this is something I didn't emphasize, is that all of this information is the current state of the archaeology up until the Turkish invasion in 1974. So when you're looking across the island and looking at burial patterns in the south, the picture is going to be very different than everything you have pre-1974 in the north. And so I think, you know, that I don't know, it's useful to compile it all, but in terms of some of the conclusions, we have an inaccurate data set, or flawed data set, I should say.
Certainly in her publications, she likes what you say.
Yeah.
She quotes you extensively in terms of on the interpretive side. Okay. Come on, someone, one.
I have a question, and this is a question totally from ignorance. So what's up with the human sacrifice? Is this like a captured soldier or a servant or something else?
There are skeletons that were found in the dromoi. You saw how shallow they were. And one of the things that I didn't mention, that there's some Roman phases. So Tomb 1 was found first in the late 1950s. And there were a number of different, they found evidence of a fire there, they had evidence of, I think the cremated bones were in there. And right from the very beginning, the Homeric connection was identified, and that also coincided with the foundation of the Republic of Cyprus in 1960. So, I mean, even Karagiorgis in his later writings said that he used Homer, quote unquote, as a Bible as they excavated. So then, when I think it's Tomb 2, they found a human skeleton within. You know, I think there was already a preconceived notion in terms of what they wanted to find. I don't know if people looked at cut marks. I don't know if the skeletal material. I think in one, maybe it is the tomb too. The description has the arms being crossed. That suggests that maybe it was bound. But I also think, if I'm remembering it correctly, that the remains were near the entrance of the dromos, as opposed like many of the horse sacrifices were right near that propylium area. So, I think that it definitely could be re-examined if those remains are, I don't know, so most of this material, or some of this material is on display in the Cyprus Museum in Nicosia. I imagine that some of the other material were in the Famagusta Museum during the invasion, and I think much of it probably was lost. So I don't know if anyone's actually gone back and looked at. I can tell you that the horse remains, you may have seen in some of the photos, they have a little covering over those, and they're still in the dromoi, and they're just essentially disintegrating under the sun.
Yes.
You said that in the Cellarka, some of the Cellarka dromoi, there's horse sacrifices too. There's like the horse and donkey distinction for the royal tombs? Do you see that in the Cellarka one at all, or is it all horses? Or
I think they're all donkeys.
They're all donkeys.
I'd have to go back and double check, but I think that it was donkeys.
I think so too.
So, based on both the pre-burial of the dromos, when you have this broad building-like facade, and then your interpretation that perhaps the tops of these with the kind of molding were left unfinished, do we think that this was meant to replicate more the look of a city, of buildings, than of what we would normally think of as tombs? If we leave these burials with kind of the tops of walls, as if you would go to Enkomi and see the tops of walls, which you would recognize as being the remains of a town instead of simply what we would think of as burial mounds, and if so, what does it do that you're kind of creating a burial landscape that isn't specifically burial so much as it is replicatory of regular cities, more like a necropolis in the polis sense than in the sense of a lot of tombs put together?
So that's, I think this is the part that, it was just fun to speculate about in terms of what it may have actually looked like. And that was something I certainly, because I was really looking at this connection with Enkomi, and that's what I saw it as more that, it's intended to make people think about the town, as opposed for people to think, okay, this is the actual cemetery. People probably knew, thought of it as both. Whether or not, how much was visible, one course, does it really remind somebody of architecture? Part of it is that we don't really know, of course, how much was visible at Enkomi. But taking into account the Iron Age evidence, the dedications, how flat the landscape was, and how massive some of those blocks are, I suspect something is visible. They must have known about it, but beyond that, I think it's really pure speculation.
Well, so what I'm thinking is, what does it do to bury someone in a town? Right? Normally you want to kind of distinguish between funerary architecture and
Right.
civic architecture, and it seems like here you're deliberately blurring those lines.
Sure. Well, yeah, and I think that's something, what's so distinct about these tombs are how broad those facades are. So I don't think, that's something totally unique, which I tried to emphasize. So when people saw it, they would have thought of a building and not necessarily a tomb. And you're right that it is blurring it. There is the Bronze Age tradition of burials within the towns, under streets, within structures, and most of the time in the Iron Age, they're in a separate area. So whether or not, that's, that gets back to the question that was raised, whether or not they knew about the built tombs at Enkomi. When I was thinking about it, I suspected no, that there really wasn't a relation, that the inspiration for these tombs just came from the architecture of the city, because I thought it was just too speculative to say, okay, that tomb was definitely visible. But you're right, it probably is blurring it intentionally.
Other comments, questions, complaints? I think maybe not of a city, but of a building facade. And maybe maybe if Teucer, that this might be thought of as the House of Teucer. Monumentality, and so you, Kevin Fisher has looked at these Enkomi houses using various kinds of access analysis, and one of his points is lines of view and places where people gather and they can see certain things, and often the rooms in Enkomi are where this happens, in fact, have ashlar on the inside, but that the innermost place they can't see into, so that the most interesting place is outside of your line of vision. So in this case, the dromos is a place where people could gather, or at least watch things happening, but the inside the chamber, off limits house, just as in, if you're not, if you looked at Enkomi, the entrance is, you only could see a little bit in. So you would have to be invited in to go into the hall where this would be. So part of this says who's allowed, who's not, what you can see, what you can't see. So I think maybe not of the city, but of let's say an elite building, which these buildings were. One thing is underplayed. The tomb 50A is very important, because tomb 50A was found after the fact. But tomb 50A, in fact, is the earliest tomb. It dates to the beginning of the 8th century. It had only one burial, and then later 50 was built on top of it, and I speculated that that is him. Sexist as I am there. That is the first king of Salamis. That was his tomb, and then they, who did it in a, started the cemetery, and then the others, because they didn't think that through at that point.
Yeah.
And then his followers, his successors, then went and did it. So that is the earliest, has the earliest material, mid Cypro-Geometric 3, beginning of the 8th century. The rest are later, as your good chart shows, the burial material. Cyprus, as you probably know or might not know, is burdened with the Swedish system of Cypro-Geometric 1, 2, 3, Cypro-Archaic 1, 2, which don't necessarily meet with other chronologies very well, especially with Holland. Okay, so we don't know. But it was pretty good, wasn't it? So, thank you very much.